When you hear about geopolitics being on fire, well, sometimes it's not just a metaphor. For families in the West Bank, it can mean ending the night with charred homes and fresh graves.
Absolutely. And that's what we're diving into today, the really complex, escalating situation in the West Bank. It goes way beyond just the headlines.
Right. We want to unpack the layers here. We're looking at everything from, policy decisions made miles away in Washington.
All the way down to what's happening on the ground in these small villages. We've pulled together official reports, news analyses, data from NGOs, a real mix of sources.
Exactly. The aim is to give you a clear, comprehensive understanding of what's actually going on, why it's happening, and importantly, why it matters.
Okay. So where should we start? Washington seems like the logical place given the policy influence.
Yeah, let's start there. The Biden administration, back in February, they rolled out this new executive order. It's a sanctions tool, and it's already blacklisted, I think, over 24 Israeli settlers accused of violence in the West Bank.
And analysts, well, they're really taking notice. Some are calling it the most forceful step the U.S. has taken on this since maybe the Obama era. Those settlement red lines back then.
That's a pretty strong label. Most forceful step.
It signals a definite shift, or at least an attempted shift, in how the administration is trying to handle the violence.
But is everyone seeing it that way? I mean, is it seen as genuinely impactful or maybe more symbolic, especially when you look at what's still happening on the ground?
That's the debate, really. You've got those who see it as a strong signal, putting down a marker.
Yes.
Then others argue it's, well, limited. It doesn't tackle the root causes, like the settlements themselves, maybe. And then you look over at Congress, and things get even murkier.
How so?
Well, you've got this split screen almost. On one side, there's this bipartisan bill, the West Bank Violence Prevention Act, H.R. 3045.
Okay.
And it talks tough, threatens visa bans, asset freezes for anyone involved in attacks on civilians. Doesn't matter if they're Israeli or Palestinian.
And the sponsors are saying...
They're framing it clearly as protecting the two-state vision. That's the stated goal.
Okay, so that's one track. But then,
almost in the same breath, you see Congress fast-tracking another bill, H.R. 1229. And this one, it expands the U.S. military partnership with Israel. Massively.
Expands how? What kind of things are we talking about?
Oh, specifics like more Iron Dome funding and reloads, AI-driven drone defense tech, even joint research into hypersonic weapons, really advanced stuff.
Wow, so pressure on settlers with one hand, cutting-edge weapons for the state with the other.
Exactly, and that's where this label comes from. Critics call it the fund and freeze approach.
Fund the arsenal, freeze the settlers. It sounds contradictory.
It definitely highlights a core tension, doesn't it? Analysts point to this fundamental challenge in U.S. policy. How do you support a key ally's security, which they clearly want to do, while simultaneously pushing back against actions by that same ally or elements within it that actively undermine the peace process the U.S. says it supports?
Trying to have it both ways.
Pretty much. And you have to wonder about the long-term effectiveness. Plus, there's always the domestic political angle, right? The 2026 midterms aren't that far off?
Yes. The political calculus.
Neither party wants to look weak on terrorism, but they also don't want to seem indifferent to human rights abuses. So it's this very, very delicate balancing act.
Okay, so while Washington navigates that tightrope, let's shift focus to the ground, because that's where these policies, or lack thereof, have real, immediate, and often brutal consequences.
Yeah, let's talk about the reality in the West Bank. The statistics are grim, but they only tell part of the story. We need to look at specific incidents.
Like the one in Kafr Malik, that was pretty recent, June 25th.
Exactly. Kafr Malik, near Ramallah. Reports say dozens of armed settlers basically stormed the village.
Stormed it? How? What happened?
Torching cars, setting homes on fire, just chaos.
And the response. Authorities.
Well, this is crucial. According to the locals, when Israeli troops arrived, they didn't focus on arresting the settlers. Instead, they reportedly opened fire on the villagers who were trying to defend their homes, some throwing rocks.
Opened fire on the villagers. What was the result?
Tragically, 3 Palestinians were killed, 7 more wounded.
3 dead. And this isn't happening in a vacuum, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned settlement expansion earlier.
Not at all. Just before that incident, Israel's finance minister approved plans for 22 completely new settlements.
22. That sounds like a lot.
It's the largest single approval, the largest expansion since 2020, and international warnings apparently just brushed aside.
So the violence escalates and the building continues. What do the overall numbers look like since, say, the October 7th attacks?
The figures from humanitarian monitors are frankly, alarming. We're talking nearly 1,000 Palestinians killed in the West Bank since October 7th, 2023.
1,000.
Yeah. And many of those deaths, according to the monitors, happened during raids by either settlers or the Israeli army.
It's easy to get lost in the numbers,
Yeah.
but like you said, each one is a person, a family.
Absolutely. I read one report quoting a teacher in Ramallah. She described it as living with a knot in your stomach, just this constant fear, never knowing when the quiet will shatter.
That paints a picture. And how are these events described? I imagine the narratives differ wildly.
Oh, completely. You hear the IDF talking about battling terror networks, dismantling militant infrastructure. That's their framing.
Okay.
But from the Palestinian perspective, especially villagers facing these raids, they often call it state-backed vigilantism. They feel unprotected or worse, targeted.
Two totally different realities being described.
And the daily reality for many is caught somewhere between those narratives. Life in places like Jenin refugee camp or navigating checkpoints in Hebron. It's a constant cycle of lockdowns, sudden night raids, sometimes these intimidating settler marches appearing out of nowhere.
It sounds exhausting
Yeah.
and frightening. So, with all this happening on the ground, how is the rest of the world responding? Is the international community managing to do anything effective?
Well, we see actions, but the effectiveness is debatable. Take the UN General Assembly. On June 12th, they had a vote.
Right.
Huge majority, 149 to 12, demanding Israel lift the Gaza blockade and ensure aid flows. Now, the language implicitly covers West Bank crossings, too.
And the U.S.
Abstained. Didn't vote yes, didn't vote no.
What about the Security Council? They have more teeth, theoretically.
Theoretically. Recent briefings there highlighted, and I'm quoting loosely here, continued settlement acceleration in direct violation of Resolution 2334.
That's the big one on settlements, isn't it? Calls them illegal.
Exactly. Calls them a flagrant violation of international law, a major block to peace. But again, while the U.S. delegate talked about commitment to a two-state solution,
They vetoed stronger language.
they vetoed stronger language targeting the settlements more directly. So you see this frustration building in international forums. Lots of condemnation, not much enforcement.
And meanwhile, the humanitarian situation just gets worse.
It does. UNRWA, that's the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, their latest report is stark. It counted 300 separate settler incidents just since May.
300
Yeah.
in just a couple of months. What kind of incidents?
Everything from burning farmland, which destroys livelihoods, to actual ambushes on roads. And get this, aid trucks now need military escorts, even inside the West Bank, not just near Gaza.
Aid trucks needing escorts in the West Bank. That's a significant indicator of how bad things are.
It really is. It speaks volumes about the breakdown of basic security and order, and it creates this strange paradox, you know?
What do you mean?
You hear diplomats talking about crisis fatigue, like the world is getting tired of hearing about it.
Yeah, you do hear that term.
But every single statistic, every report from the ground isn't shouting fatigue. It's shouting escalation. Things are getting worse, not better. Aid is harder to deliver. People are less safe.
So this intense local conflict, the settler violence, the military raids, it's not contained, is it? How does it connect to the wider region?
No, not at all. It's definitely plugged into the bigger regional chessboard. Look at the data from ACLED, that's the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project.
Okay, what does it show?
Their figures indicate that cross-border clashes, mainly between Israel and Hezbollah-linked groups up north, spiked by 60% just in May. 60%.
Wow, that's a huge jump. So the tension is radiating outwards.
Radiating outwards and also feeding back inwards. You have to look at the internal Palestinian dynamics, too.
Meaning the split between Fatah and Hamas.
Yeah. Hamas feels emboldened, you could say, by its narrative around the 2023 attacks, and it's openly sparring with Fatah, which runs the Palestinian Authority, over who actually controls things in West Bank towns.
And that creates instability.
It creates a power vacuum. When the official Palestinian Authority seems weak or absent, who fills the gap? Sometimes it leaves villagers feeling like they have no one to turn to, which circles back to what people reported in Kaf Malik having to defend themselves.
Right, and hovering over all of this.
It's the shadow of Iran. At least that's the constant perception in Washington and Tel Aviv.
The proxy war idea.
Every flashpoint in the West Bank, every rocket from Lebanon or Yemen, they see potential links back to Tehran. They point to things like drone parts, apparently traced to Iran, showing up across the region.
So it's all interconnected. Local grievances, national politics, regional power plays.
A very tangled web.
Okay, so given this incredibly complex and volatile situation. What happens next? It feels like things could go in several directions. Can we sort of map out some potential scenarios?
Well, analysts often sketch out a few possibilities, though obviously predicting the future here is difficult. Let's call the first one scenario A, the optimistic path, maybe.
Optimistic how?
This is where Washington's pressure, those sanctions, the visa bans, actually start to bite. Extremist settlers get spooked, maybe the Israeli courts step up prosecutions more seriously.
Okay.
Violence starts to dip slowly, and maybe, just maybe, it creates enough space for some kind of peace talks to reboot.
That sounds hopeful, but maybe a long shot. What scenario B?
Scenario B is less rosy. Here, Tel Aviv basically ignores the international pressure, maybe even doubles down on settlement expansion.
Right.
U.S.-Israel relations get strained, maybe publicly frayed, but critically, Congress keeps the military aid flowing anyway.
The fund and freeze continues, essentially.
Pretty much. And in this scenario, Palestinians feel like diplomacy and U.S. pressure are dead ends. So they turn increasingly towards international courts, like the ICC or ICJ, and perhaps towards militant groups, feeling they have no other way to resist the occupation and the violence.
Okay, that sounds much more destabilizing. Is there a worse scenario?
Unfortunately, yes. Scenario C is the nightmare outcome. This involves some kind of major regional shock.
Like what?
Like, say, a full-blown missile exchange between Hezbollah and Israel that spirals out of control, something that drags the entire region in.
And the West Bank gets caught in the middle.
Engulfed. In that scenario, the kind of clashes and raids we're seeing today, as awful as they are, might end up looking, well, quaint in comparison to a wider war.
That's a chilling thought. Quaint.
It is. And all these scenarios, from the optimistic to the dire, really hang on a couple of key unknowns, don't they?
What are the biggest question marks?
Two huge ones. First, the U.S. elections in 2026. Will a new Congress or maybe even a new administration down the line change tack? Will they lean harder into sanctions or back off? That's critical.
And the second?
Palestinian leadership. President Mahmoud Abbas is aging. His legitimacy is questioned by many Palestinians. Can he or Fatah manage a stable succession? Is there a credible heir who can unite people?
Or does that power vacuum just get worse?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Does the simmering street anger boil over into open revolt before any kind of stable transition happens? That's the other massive uncertainty.
So we circle back, policy debates, funding lines decided in Washington.
Mm-hmm.
And the tangible result, the smoke you can taste, is parents burying their children in places like Kafr Malik. It's not abstract.
Not at all. And maybe that's the thought to leave with you, our listeners. What does it truly mean?
Yeah.
What does it mean when these high-level geopolitical decisions, these debates about sanctions or military aid, translate so directly, so brutally into that kind of human cost on the ground?
Something to really reflect on.
Yeah.
The human cost behind the headlines. We encourage you to keep looking beyond those headlines, keep asking questions, keep that worldview wide open. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah.
Until next time.